she's beyond that. She's totally different. I like to say she's in between the two pictures. She's been to her analyst because she's now all straightened. She's a much nicer person in this film.
She thought she was walking away from heartbreak with a second chance at her career. But what she didn't know was that the deal she signed would become one of Hollywood's most ruthless betrayals and nearly destroy Clint Eastwood's reputation forever. Picture this. Sandra Locke, fresh off an Oscar nomination for her very first film, is invited onto a Clint Eastwood set in the mid-1970s. She's talented, sharp, and completely different from the women Hollywood usually places next to its leading men. Eastwood notices. What starts as casual conversations between takes turns into a deep, creative partnership, and a romance that will define both of their careers for more than a decade. Over the years, they become inseparable. She moves into his Bel Air mansion. They share pets, dinner parties, and the kind of quiet domestic life that tabloids love to pretend is perfect. On screen, their chemistry is undeniable. The outlaw, Josie Wales, Every Which Way But Loose, Bronco Billy, audiences eat it up, and Eastwood's star soars even higher. But Locke isn't just along for the ride. She's directing her own films, pushing into territory where very few women are allowed to go in the 1980s studio system. She has opinions, vision, and, most importantly, the trust of one of Hollywood's most bankable actors. In the public eye, it looks like a fairy tale, the perfect power couple, thriving in love and work. Yet those closest to them start to notice cracks. Long stretches of time when they barely speak between takes. Rumors that Eastwood is quietly seeing other women. And whispers, always whispered, that Locke is more of a guest in his life than an equal partner. For Locke, the signs are impossible to ignore. What she doesn't know is that the man she trusts most is already preparing to end everything, swiftly, coldly, and without warning. And when that day comes, it won't just break her heart. It will launch one of the most explosive Hollywood legal battles of the decade. And that battle is only just beginning. It happened while she was working. Locke was in the middle of directing her own film, Impulse, a project she'd fought to get off the ground. She was living in the Bel Air home she'd shared with Eastwood for years, a place filled with the trophies of their life together. Then, one afternoon, she came back to find the locks changed, her belongings trapped inside. No warning, no conversation, just a silent message. You're out. To anyone else, it might have looked like a breakup. But for Locke, it was something far more brutal, a public shaming from the man who knew every detail of her life. Eastwood's timing was no accident. While she was busy on set, her foundation at home was being ripped out from under her. The tabloids smelled blood, circling the story with headlines that reduced their 14 years together to scandal fodder. Locke's response was just as sudden. Instead of disappearing quietly, she hired an attorney and filed a palimony suit, a legal action similar to divorce proceedings for unmarried couples. She wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking for recognition. 14 years of shared life, work, and sacrifice. And she was being erased in an afternoon. The lawsuit cracked open the polished facade of Eastwood's image. Court documents painted a very different picture of their relationship, one in which Locke's career had been sidelined, while Eastwood held the keys to her opportunities, both literally and figuratively. Hollywood was stunned. Fans picked sides. And Eastwood, accustomed to controlling the story, was suddenly trapped in one he couldn't direct. But as messy as the headlines were, Locke didn't realize that what came next would be even more dangerous. Because when Eastwood made his next move, it would look like an act of generosity. But underneath, It was something else entirely. And it would turn their legal battle into a full-scale war. On paper, it looked like a truce. After months of tense negotiations, Eastwood's lawyers came forward with what seemed like a lifeline. A settlement worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, a house, and, most importantly, a development deal at Warner Brothers valued at $1.5 million. The deal would give Locke an office on the lot, a production team, and the chance to develop and direct her own projects. For Locke, it felt like more than money. It felt like a second chance. After years of having her career orbit around Eastwood's, here was a chance to stand on her own. Warner Brothers was one of the most powerful studios in the industry. An office there wasn't just an address, it was a statement. It said, "She belongs here." She signed the agreement, dropped the palimony suit, and tried to believe this was the beginning of something new. She decorated her office, met with Warner executives, and started pitching. Scripts rolled in, ideas were developed, and for the first time in years, Locke allowed herself to imagine a future without Eastwood's shadow. But quickly, something felt wrong. Every pitch, no matter how polished, was rejected. Every meeting ended the same way: polite smiles, vague promises, and nothing moving forward. Locke was no rookie. She knew the industry was tough, but this felt different. She began to notice a pattern. Projects didn't just stall, they died on contact. Still, she held on. Maybe the right project just hadn't come along. Maybe her break was still around the corner. But deep down, the doubts were growing louder. Then came a piece of information she couldn't ignore. A detail buried in financial records that would blow the whole deal apart. The Warner Brothers Development Fund? It wasn't Warner's money. It came directly from Clint Eastwood. And not just from his bank account, through a financial arrangement tied to the profits from Unforgiven, his Oscar-winning triumph. The realization hit hard. This wasn't a studio investing in her career. This was Eastwood buying the illusion of opportunity and paying to keep her from ever working again. It wasn't a settlement. It was a trap, and Locke was ready to tear it apart. The war was about to enter its most dangerous phase. Once she saw the truth, she couldn't unsee it. The Warner Brothers deal, the one she thought would be her rebirth, wasn't a lifeline at all. It was a cage, carefully constructed and sealed with a smile. Clint Eastwood hadn't just funded it, he'd orchestrated it. The whole thing was designed to look legitimate to outsiders, while quietly ensuring she'd never direct another film. Locke started connecting the dots. Every no from Warner suddenly made sense. Those closed-door meetings, the friendly executives who seemed strangely indifferent to her ideas. It was all theater. Warner wasn't in business with her. They were in business with Eastwood. And the terms of that business were simple. Keep her busy, keep her quiet, keep her out of the way. The betrayal cut deeper than the breakup ever had. This wasn't just personal. It was professional sabotage. Eastwood hadn't simply ended their relationship. He'd moved to erase her from Hollywood itself. Locke had given 14 years of her life to a man who now appeared to be spending millions to make sure she'd never succeed without him. And the more she dug, the worse it got. She learned the $1.5 million was tied to profits from Unforgiven, a film that had become Eastwood's crowning achievement. While he was on stage accepting Oscars, Locke was sitting in a Warner Brothers office, unemployed in everything but name, watching her career slip further away with each passing month. This wasn't a bad deal. This was a setup, and it had been executed so quietly, so elegantly, that if she'd just gone along, history might have recorded it as her failure, not his manipulation. But Locke wasn't going to let that happen. She gathered documents, talked to lawyers, and prepared to go back into battle. This time, it wouldn't be about romance, property, or shared memories. This time, it would be about fraud, betrayal, and the cold mechanics of Hollywood power. And as her case began to take shape, it became clear. If she won, the fallout wouldn't just damage Eastwood. It could shatter the carefully cultivated image he'd built over decades. And Clint Eastwood had no intention of letting that happen. The second lawsuit was a declaration of war. In 1995, Locke filed a new case, this time accusing Eastwood of fraud, intentional interference, and breaching the very agreement he'd used to end their first legal fight. It wasn't just about money now, it was about exposing the machinery behind the sham deal and showing the world how one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures had allegedly manipulated the system to bury her career. From day one, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. Eastwood arrived with his trademark calm, the squint, the soft voice. Every bit the man of integrity image his movies sold. Locke, on the other hand, walked in with stacks of evidence, financial statements, internal memos, timelines that lined up a little too perfectly. Her lawyers painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. They argued that the Warner Brothers deal wasn't a real opportunity at all. It was camouflage for Eastwood's payoff, disguised to keep her from working. They laid out how more than 30 projects Locke had pitched were rejected without serious consideration, and how Warner executives never truly intended to produce her films. As the weeks passed, cracks began to form in Eastwood's defense. Witnesses described the deal in vague, evasive terms. Some admitted they didn't remember reviewing her proposals at all. One even acknowledged that Eastwood had been reimbursing Warner for the full cost of her employment. The jury listened, and according to those who followed the trial closely, they were leaning toward Locke by a striking margin of 10-2. A win would have been more than a headline. It could have tarnished Eastwood's spotless public image, cost him millions, and set a precedent for holding powerful Hollywood figures accountable for backroom sabotage. But just as the momentum was reaching its peak, before the verdict could be read, everything stopped. Behind closed doors, the two sides reached a confidential settlement. The details were sealed, the jury dismissed, and the case vanished from the court calendar as if it had never happened. To the public, it was just another private resolution. But for those who knew how close Locke had come to a total victory, it felt more like a silencing. She had forced one of Hollywood's untouchable icons to the brink. And somehow, the curtain fell before the final act. And while the courtroom battle was over, the shadow it cast would linger, for both of them. Because the truth, once spoken, can't ever be fully buried. This was never just a lover's quarrel. What happened between Sondra Locke and Clint Eastwood was a masterclass in how power operates in Hollywood and how easily it can be used to erase someone. On the surface, it was the messy end of a long relationship. But underneath, it was a warning about what happens when you cross a man who controls both the personal and professional levers of your life. Locke's fight pulled back the curtain on a system built to protect its stars, not its strivers. In an industry where women directors were already rare, her story became a whispered cautionary tale. Speak out, and you might never work again. Studios could smile to your face, fill your office with scripts, and still make sure nothing you touched ever saw the light of day. And the parallels to today are hard to ignore. Decades before, Locke was already living that reality, calling out a powerful man, facing retaliation, and discovering that justice in Hollywood often comes wrapped in a settlement that keeps the ugliest truths locked away. The only difference now is that the stories are harder to bury, thanks to the internet. Yet, in the mid-1990s, Locke stood almost alone. She didn't have social media armies or public sympathy on her side. She had to go head-to-head with one of the most respected men in the industry, knowing full well the personal and professional cost. And while she walked away without a public verdict, the cracks in Eastwood's image were real. For those who paid attention, the lawsuits revealed a side of him that no film role could disguise. Locke's courage also left a trail for others. It showed that even if you're outmatched in resources, you can still force a reckoning. You can still make a story impossible to forget. But the price was steep. Hollywood moved on without her, and her once promising directing career never recovered. She became, in many ways, a ghost in an industry that didn't want to remember her, until decades later, when a new generation began to see her as something else entirely. Not just an actress, but one of the first women to take on the system and live to tell the story. And while Eastwood's career continued, unshaken in the public eye, Locke's battle remains a quiet reminder of the cost of speaking truth to power. Sandra Locke's story didn't end in a courtroom. After the settlement, she quietly stepped away from the Hollywood spotlight. There were no triumphant comebacks, no surprise directorial hits, just the slow fade of a career that might have been. She battled illness in her later years, and when she passed away in 2018, the news barely made headlines. There were no public statements from Clint Eastwood, no acknowledgement from the man who had once shared her home, her screen, her life. But her absence didn't erase what she'd done. Long before Hollywood was forced to confront its power imbalances, Locke stood up and said, "This isn't right." She exposed a hidden playbook: how charm can mask control, how opportunity can be weaponized, and how silence is often bought, not earned. Eastwood's career survived untouched. He kept directing, kept winning awards, kept being the stoic hero on screen. But for those who knew the story, the shine was never quite the same. And that's the thing about truth. It has a way of lingering in the corners, even when people try to look away. Locke may not have won in the traditional sense, but she forced one of the most powerful men in Hollywood into a fight he didn't want, and nearly beat him. Her story is a reminder that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's simply refusing to be erased. And decades later, as more voices rise and more hidden stories come to light, her fight feels less like a footnote and more like a warning. That behind the red carpets and the golden statues, there are battles the audience never sees. And the people who fight them often pay the highest price.